Okay, you're listening to Touchless Beasts, and this goes to the first episode here, titled "A Critical Link in the Supply Chain is Broken." Now, I guess I should just go ahead and explain this, because it came up after I had looked at some things and I had talked to some people, and I had realized that the economists that I normally follow, who I think to be pretty smart individuals, most of them, it seems like it, these are people that I pay attention to because they're very often good at assessing the situation. And when it comes to predictions, I don't know if I can say that they're all that fond of making them. But when they do, they're rather general and fairly accurate, if not precise. Certainly that's a much harder thing to do when you're talking about the economy, which is literally everything everybody does. So at the end of the day, that's just too big of a thing to consider. Economics being probably one of the most cumbersome, perilous aspects of the social sciences, as you can imagine. So I take a lot of cues from other people and what I can find on my own and try to stitch together some kind of nightmare of an explanation for myself. And if it seems to be working for me, I tend to share it. So that's all I'm doing with Touchless Beasts, and that's all I plan on doing with it. So again, sit down, get yourself a lot of salt to take with what I'm about to say. And hopefully this gives you a little more depth than just reading it, although I'm going to be reading most of it, as you understand. Okay. So we got to start at the beginning. Well, I'm really going to start with the end. So former Greek finance minister, who's also currently a member of the Hellenic Parliament, Yanis Varoufakis, he explained in a piece in Project Syndicate, as a matter of a conclusion, towards the end of a very short article, he said, after 2 decades of a central bank-supported bonanza of soaring asset prices and rising corporate debt, a little price inflation was all it took to end the power game that shaped the post-2008 world in the image of a revived ruling class. So what happens now? There's a link, of course, that you can follow in the written form of this, and you can read the whole thing. Unfortunately, it goes back in time to a point that we might not want to look at. So, what kind of little price inflation could have been spun out into across-the-board inflation fast enough to break 40-year records? This was my question. What kind of little price inflation could have been the thing that causes across-the-board inflation that breaks 40-year records? And what I mean by that, that's a rate of increase going so fast, an increase in prices going up so fast, we haven't seen it since the early 80s. So that's impressive. You might remember, we could take this back to 2018. But for sure, a great deal of talk was given about the shortage of microprocessors or computer chips in 2021, like in the middle of the pandemic scenario. But however, in the years since then, a great deal of attention has been on supply chain disruptions, and we've definitely heard about that too, as a culprit for shortages and inflation, right? So on the one hand, you look at, there's too much money, there's too little goods, or whatever. So in either case, right? But a look into the world of programmable logic controllers was brought to my attention by a few friends in manufacturing. I know a few people that work in a couple places, people who work in wood products, milling, manufacturing, food, packaging, and other things. And these are people who aren't just regular line workers. These are people who fix the equipment and the machines in these places. Okay? Never thought it would be an interesting time to know people like that, and thankfully they're good friends of mine. So I get all kinds of details. Now, and for obvious reasons, I'm not going to name the businesses, and I'm not going to name the people involved, because there's a reason these details aren't out in the open. But nevertheless, I can tell you they're there. You're just going to have to believe me. You can find stuff. I found some things in Reddit groups, some forums, and so on about this kind of issue. And some of it goes back before the pandemic, as you can imagine, but it's particularly bad now. So, yeah, the latest conversation has been about supply chain disruptions. But you do remember before that, there was a concern about chips, computer chips. It's the easiest way for people to understand it. You say microprocessor, integrated circuits, blah, blah, blah. You start talking about all of these things and you lose people. So chips, not the crunchy kind. I don't think there's anything fried about these yet. So although it was difficult for me to find mainstream media coverage of what could be seen as a crisis, there were plenty of industry, press, and direct business communications to customers about the issue. For example, from a website called Industrial Shields, which is a Spanish PLC provider. They provide these programmable logic controllers. They're a Spanish company. And there's an excerpt from a person named Fernandez Corral Martinez, and this is from December of 2021, so about 7 months ago, a little over 7 months ago. This is just an excerpt from that. The website, where he said this conflict they were talking about with Huawei had some far-reaching repercussions. The main one came at the end of 2018, they say, when Meng Wanzhou, Huawei's CEO and heiress, was arrested in Vancouver, Canada on charges of alleged fraud, conspiracy, and embezzlement. This incident led to U.S. companies such as Google and Apple being forced to stop dealing with Huawei with the economic loss that this entailed. Now, do you probably remember that Huawei was part of the whole 5G next generation cell phone stuff and all this before the pandemic? There's some shake-up punishment of Huawei. Now, this piece also says from Industrial Shields, and again, this is a Spanish source, this whole situation, they say, generated by the U.S. government sowed panic in Asian companies, which have been accumulating a larger stock than normal, producing an imbalance in the production system. And this is what it has to do with getting access to microprocessors, getting access to chips for their programmable logic controllers. Okay? Because when you make programmable logic controllers, you need computer chips. Okay. Very particular kinds of computer chips, too. They're not exactly the same kinds of things that you get that go in your laptop necessarily. All right? But this is the same technology. Now, the idea is, what they're saying, if you pick this up, they're saying there was a panic in Asian companies. So East Asia and Asian companies, just generally, we're probably talking about everything within a few thousand miles of China, is definitely dependent on these chips too for their own manufacturing and so on. Okay, and their own production needs. They need these chips too. And being concerned that the U.S. government had done some things and that U.S. companies were bailing on a Chinese company, and that, it's like, who's next? How much of this U.S. government stuff going after Chinese tech companies is going to put us in trouble? So this causes larger stock than normal, accumulating. So stockpiling happens, according to this company's person they have writing in their website about how, look, blaming the government, U.S. government, of course, and attacking China to cause a panic in Asia that causes places over there to stockpile these chips. So a company like Spain or Italy or some place in Austria that needs to make PLCs can't get computer chips. They blame the United States for this, of course. So certainly the statement that they're making places the onus of the issue on the U.S. government with regard to sanctioning a Chinese company. That didn't satisfy me. So I looked at businesses closer to home. There was this piece from Rockwell's senior vice president and chief supply chain officer, Ernest Nicholas. And this is on Rockwell Automation's website, or it was anyway, as of a week or so ago. And Rockwell Automation is a large provider of PLCs in the U.S. market and elsewhere too. It's also, I think, Alan Bradley is also related to that, which is maybe a name more people are familiar with, but Rockwell Automation. Well, I just took a chunk out of Ernest Nicholas's statement. It's an excerpt that's, I think, kind of sums the whole thing up. And Nicholas says, this is the Rockwell chief supply chain guy, says, our global supply chain plays a critical role in serving our channel partners and customers. We, along with many industries and customers, continue to feel the broad-based challenges in our supply chain due to the pandemic. Oh, as I have shared previously, he says, ongoing supply constraints stemming from component shortages and related issues continue to impact our business. See, this is a real thing. This is a company making this totally available on their own website. It's a message to their customers saying, as I have shared previously. So this is from January of 2022. That's from this year. I've said this before. Ongoing supply constraints stemming from component shortages. Note he won't say what component it is. Component shortages and related issues continue to impact our business. The component shortages, that what they're talking about is a particular thing that they need for the PLCs. You know, they have the plastic housing, they have the wires, might have some integrated circuits, they have printed boards, they have all these other things. The mounting hardware, oh, that's fine, sure. There's something they're missing. Some component shortage. Of course, we know what it is. But he says, these market conditions have resulted in more frequent changes to our sales order promise dates and longer lead times for some of our product lines. Yeah, like all of them. Now, one of the people that I was talking to about this, who actually alerted me to this problem, is that it's not just Rockwell Automation and the attendant Alan Bradley. It's also things like Westinghouse, Temple Sonic. There's a couple of different things that make even more specialized things or need more specialized things for things like flame controller PLCs or extrusion controller PLCs, which are things that operate proportional valve operations. I mean, very, very amazing stuff, actually, the stuff that he was explaining. And how all of these programmable logic controllers and their various varieties and applications and uses, you know. So it's pretty extensive. So I'm telling you from people who supply these PLCs what they're saying in Spain and here and so on. And this being said, from these people, as honest and as straightforward as it can be, and obviously they're not making stuff up, right, in Spain or at Rockwell. There's also the general sentiment from the White House. And this has been, you haven't heard about this lately because the Ukraine-Russia thing pops up at a really inconvenient time to get any kind of useful information to people. So the White House sentiment was noted by, there was a piece in Bloomberg referring to a report that was made by the by the Commerce Department. And the U.S. Commerce Department had a report, and according to Bloomberg, this Jenny Leonard and Ian King, from January 25th of this year, 2022. They kind of point this out. You remember what the Rockwell supply chain guy was saying? He's like, this is continuing to cause problems with our dates, our promised dates for delivery. Well, the report that Bloomberg was talking about was based on information from more than 150 companies in the chip supply chain. In the chip supply chain. And that 150 companies in the chip supply chain showed there is a significant, persistent mismatch in supply and demand for chips. I like that. There is a significant, this is what they're quoting from the report in Bloomberg, right? After this, there's a survey of 150 companies in the chip supply chain, and what that shows is, quote, there is a significant, persistent mismatch in supply and demand for chips. I like that. There's a significant, persistent mismatch between supply and demand for chips. What's the mismatch? Note what it doesn't say. Of course, if you looked at the report, here's the conclusion that Bloomberg makes out of the report. The companies don't see the problem being solved in the next 6 months, according to the report. They don't see it being solved in the next 6 months. And this was from the end of January. We're past 6 months from the end of January, aren't we? Oh no. January 25th, and we're close. Now, one of the things I want to point out, okay, wasn't going to be resolved in 6 months. I can tell you that it's worse than that. All right. And it should be easy to see this as a problem in the abstract, but it helps to understand what the chip shortage means generally to the supply of programmable logic controllers in the context of their application. So you can't just say chip shortage, and a lot of people are saying, oh, remember all these cars that were sitting there unfinished because they were waiting on computer components. There's still a delay on some pre-orders for cars. But that seems to be less of a problem than it used to be. So there's some guesses about this, but I'll let your imagination run wild on that. But let's think about the bigger context, other than cars, where it's easy to say, hey, your car has a bunch of computers in it. Yes. Sometimes, multiple things going on. Your cars need a lot of computer chips. That's true. Also, the things to make cars do, and a whole bunch of other things. So, PLCs, these programmable logic controllers, which is a big umbrella term to describe a lot of things, all right? They are used to automate machines, and they come in a variety of general-purpose forms and specialty designs. I've mentioned a few. They're small, fast, because they're tasked with a very narrow set of things to do, and they have to operate very quickly in some cases. Ridiculous amount. Well, you looked at an automated factory, making things like aluminum beverage cans. The machines that pump out hundreds every minute. It's just ridiculous. I think it takes something like from start to finish, by the time you drop the blank in to it dumping out an aluminum can, is 7 seconds. And if you look at all the steps, it's just amazing. And all of that is done with programmable logic controllers, all chained together in a big system. If one of those doesn't work, you have to replace it, or that line isn't going to be making aluminum cans, beverage cans. That could happen. All right. So, that's one thing. That's just one thing. Now I want you to imagine every other thing that is produced in this automated fashion. All right, so one example are those used as flame controllers. I mentioned those. Those are used to regulate industrial size boilers in hospitals, which are used for all kinds of things. boilers in hospitals have had problems. Okay, with if they're these are controlled systems. They have flame controllers that are computer controlled. If one of those breaks and you got to go buy one, good luck. Good luck. They're also used in chemical production, and they're used in petroleum refining processes. Come to find out, this has been a problem because some of the people that I've talked to, in one case, also knew about some operations in a refinery, and I'm not going to say which one, that it's in Texas. All right. And that this is a very real problem for these flame controller type PLCs that need to control boilers, which are, of course, you're using this to heat up oil in distillation processes. You have to do this, and you have to control very carefully the temperatures of things and pressures and everything else. Okay, taking oil and turning it into all the useful fuels like gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, all that stuff has to go through a process that is very dependent, for safety reasons and just for production reasons, these kinds of controllers. Now, if those break and you can't go get one, this might be a problem to making gasoline no matter how much oil you have. All right? Consider this. Again, I know this is going on. To what extent, I don't know. How big of a problem it is, but it is a problem. Another use is regulating ovens for cereal production, other food kinds of production. Okay? A lot of our stuff goes through heating processes, extrusion processes, flash freezing processes, stamping, rolling, pasting, packaging, sealing, gluing, all this. Printing and everything else. A lot of things go through these automated processes. Again, one of those PLCs in that system fails, you've got a line down until you can find a replacement, and good luck. Okay. So here's what else is funny. They're used in packaging and assembly systems, like I said, but they're also used in their own chip making and the manufacturing of PLCs and so on. So basically, if you want to think about it, the programmable logic controller, and I have a picture in there, of course, that's one kind of thing and how they look when they're in a rack. But there's all kinds of different other arrangements. You can look them up. Basically, I would say the PLC is at the heart of the modern industrial world. And it doesn't exist without a steady, reliable supply of microprocessors or chips as such. This being said, the main culprit for the supply chain disruption has to be traced to the source. What about the factories and therefore the labor that make the chips? Well, most East Asian chip manufacturers, which account for 75% of global supply, a lot of that was Taiwan. China has been rapidly trying to build that capacity up to be the dominant chip supplier, as you can imagine, mostly for its own sake. Okay. So 75% of the global supply of chips is East Asian manufacturers. They experienced COVID-19 related labor disruptions, and some still are. I mean, up until fairly recently. Factories being shut down for weeks at a time, coupled with ports being hamstrung with labor fluctuations, and all that likely is the real reason for the backlog of unfilled orders, and therefore other supply chain problems. But we can't forget the other part that Industrial Shields in Spain was explaining. That there may have been there was a regional panic and stockpile in East Asia, not here, and not in other places, apparently. So the United States, despite commanding enormous demand for these devices and their attendant chips, has not had command of domestic supply of these components for domestic needs since since the end of the 1990s, really. Even knowing the entire world of automated manufacturing and production was rapidly expanding, even knowing the computer chip was going to be as necessary as water, labor, and electricity for a modern economy, U.S. economic policy allowed the offshoring of the supply of chips and even the component assembly of PLCs and other computerized parts. Now, you can understand that this seems a little weird. That's putting a lot of eggs and taking a lot of eggs out of your basket. This is kind of strange. When you know this is the backbone of this sector of your economy, and you don't create a domestic supply. The reason being, of course, that this kind of skilled high-tech production labor, chip manufacturing, PLC assemblies, all this stuff, that kind of labor is going to be more expensive in the United States than whatever you can get as the finished or component part from China or Taiwan or something. Supposedly, that's the deal, right? But sometimes you wonder if maybe it wouldn't have been a better idea just to have it instead of running out of it. So, no matter what it costs to build it out. So despite all of that offshoring of this was allowed this whole time. There's certain kind of protectionist things that have been done to certain kinds of microprocessor manufacturers. Like you can say Intel gets a lot of government kudos and backing and help for its project of building this big complex in Ohio, which I think will take a handful of years to complete. But more importantly, what are they making? Is Intel make chips for these kinds of things? What I understand is they make fairly high dollar performance multi-purpose chips for personal computers and that kind of thing. So, and that kind of stuff for all of our little computer devices, right? So in this situation, though, it doesn't really matter how much domestic oil production you have. For example, if you cannot run the distillation systems, which are heavily dependent, like I said, to create the variety of fuels from oil. And you got that right. It also doesn't matter how much corn you have if you don't have the super fast PLCs necessary to make a cornflake, or even regulate your corn oil extraction processes. So, do you see? There's a problem. They just name something. Seriously, name something, and you can probably find that there's a PLC involved in it somewhere before it ended up in your house. Okay, so raw material and base feedstock for plastic parts, textiles, metal components, and a variety of other basic inputs utilize high-speed automated production systems. Everything does, basically. Everything. Almost everything in the artificial world is a product of this stuff. And we should also probably remember that the East Asian supply of chips also feeds massively to East Asian manufacturing, like I said, assembly and other production needs in that region as well. It would stand to reason, from what I'm saying, I think, that factories in that area are struggling to meet regional demand, which is likely easier to meet, though, and in some cases an economic policy choice to prioritize. Most likely Chinese operations are getting Chinese chips before anyone else is. The same can be said for other regional industries, as you can imagine. That would be the case. Because, China protects its own economy and its operations before it cares about anybody else, probably. From what we can tell, that's its behavior. It does develop things in other places because that has to do with its access to those markets. Okay. And it also kind of creates other markets. I'm talking about Belt Road stuff. But China definitely has a policy wanting to grow their chip production. They've been wanting to do this since the scare back in 2018. and definitely since the pandemic has demonstrated this actually might be worth building out. And they'll spend the money. They don't care. And there'll be quasi-private enterprises, state partnership things that they'll do. But on top of this, it's a well-known business tactic. And I think we got to remember the capitalism part where all of that flourishes and is allowed. On top of this, it's a well-known business tactic to redirect reduced production capacity to higher margin operations. Now, again, I have this on some good authority from one of the people that I talked to. We're talking about some food production and packaging stuff, and what he told me was basically not a thing everybody where he works even knows, but something he needed to know, and that's why he was told. And this goes to something like this. We're going to be focusing on improving our automation capability, and we're also going to be focusing on, at least in that area, in those plants, we're going to be focusing on these products that are higher margin as we're automating things. And we'll let some other division in the South somewhere, I mean in the southern United States somewhere, they'll pick up that line that we're having a hard time with and run it at just a lower level. So the idea is to go after higher margin. So you're going to shift your reduced capacity towards higher margin products, so your productivity stays up. Okay? You want to get as much out of the labor you do have. So that's a pretty standard tactic. This, though, when you redirect reduced production capacity to higher margin operations, because you literally can't do things, and in his case, the reason why is certain parts of the factory cannot work because of these PLCs they don't have. I'm not making that up. There are certain parts they literally cannot work. But they are spending money on new equipment to do higher margin things. And they will let people go. This is what he told me. They have absolutely no problem if people quit. They just won't replace them. This is an attrition program that's going on where he works. But there's a similar one that I know that's going on in wood product stuff as well. For the same reason, because as component things keep failing, certain lines are just down. They're going to focus on higher margin things, and at the very least, they just won't have the need for the labor. So if people quit, then bye. And in some cases, they're not going to replace that person. This is important. So all of this, anyway, naturally recouples with producer price index increases. Okay, what they're doing is they're taking their reduced production capacity to higher margin operations, and then that comes back together with their producer price index increases, that their inputs have gone up, so they're trying to maintain their profits, and those savings are passed on to the general market. So their producer price they're paying for inputs goes up. They've had to redirect their reduced production capacity to higher margin operations, so they're not making the other stuff as much, and so that runs into shortages. And the increase in the prices get passed on down. You know, they don't want to eat it. They're going to build that into the price. Their disruptions are going to be built into the price. In other words, not only is the market being squeezed for profit margins to stay plump, but we're all facing limits in options and component availability. So the businesses are having problems, and they're passing the savings on to you. Because they can do less, they can't do as much. That's effective decrease in supply, right? I mean, all the things are there. It's just there are these little pieces that can't exist to do it. So if there was one simple bit of pressure, then, if we go back to Yanis Varoufakis, if there was a little inflation, if there was, that would cause a huge problem. If there was one simple bit of pressure put on one silent component of the global economy, it was the chip situation, as it is available to the esoteric world of automated production. Most people don't understand it. At the heart of that chip situation is a labor situation, because that's what these automation things are for. They're the way you get away with extending labor productivity. You don't have to have as many people to do as much stuff. See, the programmable logic controller is the extension of the modern working person, really, if you think about it. And they only exist because people are also making them. There are people involved in everything. So, yeah, the heart of that chip situation is a labor situation. Once again, reminding all of us, I hope, from the shadows cast by mass media that all the money in the world does nothing on its own.